Hey guys, what's going on? I'll be doing a commentary on the new released album, The Depths, similar to how I did with Pursuit. Essentially, just like last time, it's going to be very much unscripted and very much kind of like going with the music and sort of just going with the flow of things. And I'll do my best to talk about some of like the finer details of the album because I like sort of getting my thoughts out about how everything went down over the course of like the last year or so, which is how long this album essentially took to make from the ending of Pursuit and what happened with me since. And that's sort of it. There's not really much to say like in advance because an hour and 3 minutes is kind of a lot of time to just say stuff. The issue is that I'll be sort of tempted to like say things very directly about what the music is doing. So it's there's stuff that I'd like to say just generally about the album, but I'm sure I'll be able to fit it in at some point during this hour because I'm pretty sure there's a significant amount of time for that sort of stuff. The only thing that I really wanted to mention before I got going was that The Depths was supposed to be a more direct and like simple album. It ended up being longer just because of the concept behind it and how many like tracks and stuff I wanted to get in. But in reality, it was supposed to be just like cleaner, more straightforward, obviously heavier, and just like I don't know, like a more metal record than what Pursuit was, because Pursuit was very sort of like didn't really have like a single direction where it was going. It was very kind of all over the place, and that's sort of something that I wanted to maybe remedy with this one. But let's just get to it. So the opening track, The Only Way Out, was I'm pretty sure the first track for this record that I started writing. I ended up finishing the instrumental for this significantly later. Well, not significantly, but like after a couple songs had already been kind of finished-ish. But even then, this was about August of 2018. And the vocals for this were only finished in like late December. So the song existed as an instrumental for a really long time. Mainly because it's quite different from what I've usually written historically. And so it was difficult for me to figure out like a direction I wanted to take with the vocals. Like I didn't know for sure. And so there's a lot of like experimental stuff in this one vocally. The song itself is inspired by two things. Two songs. Both of them being Devin Townsend songs, really. The first one being like overall conceptually, like the idea for the song was stemmed from Praise the Lord from Deconstruction, and how that song sort of set a very slow building start to a rather aggressive album, and how basically Devin was just saying how they're like, even though this is a very chaotic album, the terms on which it starts are still up to me, and I'm going to make them nice and slow and let it sort of simmer for a while, which is sort of how I wanted this one to feel. Like I wanted, because Pursuit really had about a minute and a half of like intro before it got heavy. This one I really wanted to like simmer and like go for a while, and sort of be like a calm intro to things. The other influence being Fly, which is another opening track just off of Ghost. And when I was listening to it a lot over the course of like this spring, I guess, or so, like 2018 spring, I liked how essentially using two chords we got like a full-on song that had its own like character and stuff. And so I explored the idea of basically using two chords to create the general feeling of the first like 4.5 minutes of this track. And then proceeding to use everything else like background effects and drums and vocals and stuff to add like colors and textures to the song that would otherwise be kind of boring. Like, because most of the most of the first half of the song, the piano was like one single take, and that was like the first thing that was done. And in reality, listening to that would have been quite boring. I also used a few, I got a little bit of inspiration from the soundtrack to Hollow Knight, which is an exceptional video game if you haven't played it. And just the soundtrack to that is also really good. And I got kind of some, again, like textural ideas listening to that, because I wanted it to have sort of like a positive vibe, but at the same time I wanted it to feel a little bit like a little somber. I think ominous would be a bad word, but something along those lines. So yeah, that's sort of like the general purpose of at least the first half of the song. I played around with a lot of like effects for just background textures, and I did some drum editing. It was difficult to get this thing to sound exactly how I wanted it to, but in the end I was pretty happy with it. And yeah, like this is probably the weirdest track that I've ever done in terms of like the structure and everything. But it was very premeditated. Like this was by design. And it sort of happened because like the whole source for the depths was kind of like almost like a compromise. And because I knew going into this album that it would be simpler, I wanted to have like a cool sort of progressive intro to it that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten if this was like a collection of songs. And this heavy section is still part of the song, and I wanted it to kind of feel like an A plus B. And initially, when writing this, I thought that the themes from this song would be a little bit more prevalent in the rest of the album. But in reality, all that really happened was there was a bit of a vocal reprise in the last track of this album, and that's about it. The two chords, which was just like B flat minor and D flat major, made like an appearance in voices. That's really all it is. The song is also like, this part was kind of cool to record, because even though the song itself is in B flat, I tuned my 7 to just drop A flat, which gave me access to like the two semitones below the B flat, and so I used a lot of like bends and stuff to create some like cool riffs here, and then I also used that like the A natural sort of like as a reinforcement for the dominant in and I guess what you could call the chorus of the song. And this chorus was sort of supposed to be kind of like anthem feeling ish, and I really, when I wrote this, I was envisioning it being like a theme that would come back, but in the end it didn't. Mainly because and the reason why it didn't was because this album was a little bit like unplanned in that sense. The whole backstory for the depths is actually kind of like interesting and kind of important to the way the album worked out in the end. Because following Pursuit, which was like released late December of 2017, basically like a few weeks later I was already working on material, and some of it's like still available on this YouTube channel, but really Oasis was the record that was supposed to come out after this one. I really like, I wanted to take what Pursuit was and take the progressive and like conceptual elements of Pursuit and really like go crazy with those and make something that was more like even more of like an exploration musically. But in reality, being about halfway finished with that record, I was quite unhappy with two things. I was unhappy with how the material I had was representing the concept behind it, because it was quite like there was a whole big like grand story behind it that may or may not have taken like multiple parts to fully like cover. And I was also, and so like I wasn't happy with the quality of the music and how it was representing the ideas behind the record. And the other thing I wasn't happy with was just like the process of writing it. Like it just didn't feel like it didn't feel very enjoyable to have like every note be like a move in a chess match, essentially, like everything being very deliberate and stuff. So initially the depths was sort of like a background thing where I would dump ideas that were a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more song oriented, which is the reason why this record feels more like songs still, but it still has an underlying idea. 9 Days is pretty much like the song I would consider the single on this album. Like it works the best as like a standalone song. There's a bunch of actually pretty cool influences in this section of the song. So I wanted to have like so 9 Days. I wanted to be like a heavy song, start to finish, and I want it to be very like driven, where it's like a constant thing, like basically just hitting you for the 5 minutes that the song goes on for. And so the first verse was quite inspired by like some of the rhythmic sections that bands like Tesseract and Periphery use. But the lyrics and the sort of like background guitars are very like Korn-like almost. And that was like subconscious, like I wasn't intending it to be that way, but it sort of turned out that way, which is pretty neat. And the rest of the song, I really wanted to have like a very like sinister feeling, mainly because this song's about like repetition and sort of being trapped inside of like days that feel the same. But it was quite fun to play around with some of the like, I don't know, so some of the harmonies that became available as I was writing it, because really like this chorus starts off with like a very like creepy sounding, just like major seventh in like a minor key. So it's just like a minor second that sounds kind of wacky, and I even bend the top note to like kind of fade in and out of the tonic. But then I sort of realized that I wanted this song to have still a little bit of a melodic aspect, and so I like changed it to I briefly made like a change that went to like a kind of like more like a more like proggy type chorus, and I had a lot of fun layering vocals for that like big sort of like crescendo towards the end. This section, this rhythm here actually was kind of like a mistake that I essentially played correctly twice in a row. And I ended up actually using that rhythm sort of like as a fundamental like theme of the album, like basically like one of the two themes. This section was really cool because it sort of came about as an accident. I wasn't originally intending to have like a nice cool melodic section in the song, but I also felt like it would be a cool like break. So when I came across this, I was like, yeah, I'm sticking this in here because I really want the song to feel like it has hope almost, because the rest of the song's like quite like angry sounding and like very deliberate again with what it wants to sound like, and this part almost felt like a nice like 30-second like relief from that, and so that's why I kept this section. The background also has a pretty weird stretch chord going on in the second guitar, and then it goes right back to this stuff. In 9 Days was probably the one song where I was very happy with how it turned out from like the moment it was finished, and it was the song that basically changed the least upon editing, because I was really happy with like how like the growls turned out, like this section, how I had like a nice like reverb delay type growl, and how there's a cool little interaction between like a center growl that was like the main vocals and then sort of like a background growl that served as like support for it. And then this section too, there's cool harmonies that I kept. And essentially most of this was like the first couple takes, and I was like, yeah, I'm happy with how it sounds. And this part was like the culmination, with like basically all of the vocal lines like going upwards with the guitar line going down, and that sort of counterpoint. acting as like the grand finale of the song, really. And lyrically, the song, like lyrically and sonically, the sound is, and the song is about repetition. So there's a lot of parts that like repeat, and like the words on and on, like just keep going for this part. And I let this note fade out to really like reinforce the fact that it's like it's not over, like nothing really ends in terms of this song. But yeah, that's kind of like a weird directionless conversation about 9 days. I'm quite happy with this track. It's quite unique compared to some stuff that I've written in the past. And it was one of the last tracks that I had to write to get this one done with. But yeah, like 9 days is a pretty straightforward song. Really not much to say. I sort of wrote it as like a song. So really, like, there's nothing really important going on behind it. Echo I used as sort of like another break to give the listener a bit of a pause, because leading up to it there's like 13 minutes of just like metal and shit, and so yeah. Also, Echo was one of the last things that I had to write. I knew what I wanted the song to be, but I didn't have the music ready for it, because in reality this is the first time you hear the theme, which I call the Echo theme, like the main piano melody that's happening in the background right now, and also like the lyric, like the vocal lines. But really, this was written a long time ago, and I just sort of decided that would be the central theme of the album. So Echo was basically like a means to introduce it, and to introduce the main theme that would come back in Drowning, which is essentially like Echo and Drowning are kind of like one single song to a degree. And then this theme would come back towards the end and sort of serve as like a central thing that basically like the whole album leads up to. This part was kind of fun to write. I essentially took like a pretty straightforward sounding theme and started like adding progressively weirder chords to it. And then, because like Echo, like the main theme is in E major, which has a very weird interaction with B flat minor, which was what both 9 days and Drowning are in, to a degree at least. So I needed to have like a way for the two things to transition into each other and like feel somewhat seamless. So there's a nice, like, one of those like cool sinister progressions that I used a couple of times on Pursuit as well. And I'm actually like really happy with like the feeling that this transition gives off. But yeah, like I don't know, not much really to say about Echo either, because it's kind of like, it's not really a standalone song. It's kind of like just a transition that leads into Drowning. And Drowning was the first track that I wrote for this album. So essentially, Drowning is kind of a wacky story, because the original riff of the song, the one that shows up at the very start, isn't actually mine. I had a buddy that was messing around with like some guitar stuff, and he showed me a riff that he essentially came up with that was in like a different time signature and everything, but it had like this minor second as like a perpetual thing that was happening in it, and I liked the feeling of it, and like I told him I can make this into like a proper song. So I went home and like within a couple days I made it into Drowning. And that's kind of like the whole point of Drowning. Like I took another like sinister sounding riff and basically built a whole song around it. And yeah, so this was basically like the starting point of the album. Like this is where the album started. Musically and thematically, this is like the ground zero almost for the depths where everything was just sort of built from. And yeah, so Drowning basically, along with Echo, introduced the whole like theme-ish for the album, and also like the weird rhythmic pattern that comes with just like playing with 8 and 7 one after the other. It does come back a few times over the course of the album, and this is sort of like the source for all of that. And yeah, I'm sort of like losing my train of thought right now, because I don't really know where I'm going with this. But Drowning was a lot of fun to do. This is the first track, and like this is actually like only one of 2 tracks in the album that involved a 6-string. So this one was in standard C sharp. And I had a lot of fun like playing around with the B flatness of the song, or like really where the song sort of started out, and like the key that the guitar wants to be in, which is C sharp. So that sort of interaction was pretty cool and sort of like a driving force for how the song worked out. And here right now is the reprise for the Echo theme, I guess, both like musically and lyrically, pretty much the same thing. But I wrote it here first and then transferred it to Echo like months later, because this song was done by like midsummer. This was like by July, I'm pretty sure this thing was done. And this section was really cool. Like I accidentally wrote a breakdown. I just liked this like chord that I was working with, so I'm like, why not just play it over and over again with like a weird rhythm. I also like the sound that I managed to get like off of the right hand doing a little bit of like cool muting work. So essentially I used like a palm mute as its own like note that would like suddenly stop like the main chord from ringing, but it would add sort of like a stop, like a dun, to the riff. And this solo ended up being the first solo that I ever recorded, and the only solo that I've ever recorded for Return to Life. It was quite cool coming up with this because I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do, because I'd never really recorded solos before. Like I'm not actually like a guitarist, so writing that, like I didn't really have a strong sense of what I wanted to do, so I just started like fucking around on like a string, and it turned out to be something pretty cool. Like it fit thematically into the song, and I kept it. Like most of that solo was one take. I had to redo like a single portion of it because I wasn't quite happy with how I performed it. But in reality, that was like basically like one accidental thing that I came up with and decided to keep. Also, fun story about that solo, I actually recorded it without properly plugging in my guitar. So it had like a very muted tone to it. And I only realized afterwards why that was, because I'm like, why does my guitar sound like shit right now? But actually, I liked how sonically it fit into the song, so I kept it the way it was. And when I redid the take, I like unplugged the guitar a little bit to get that sound back. And this last chorus was kind of like a callback to, well, not a callback, but like sort of like a reference to Gojira-esque type choruses that are essentially like based around like the interaction of like the 0 and the 1 fret and like the chords that come from those. Kind of not much to say about the ending to this, because it's kind of just like a basic callback to the main riff and then like an ending. Also, when I finished Drowning, like recording this, I accidentally got a cool like feedback to happen in the left track, and this exact like feedback was essentially what gave birth to Ration, because really I was listening to this and I was like, I could feel like a thing like coming out of this, like wah, doo, doo, doo. And so I wrote Ration. I like the first minute of Ration was written a long time ago, like again like summerish, and it was only much later towards the end of the year that I finished the rest of the song. But I really wanted Ration to be sort of like a really in-your-face song, like the most in-your-face song on the album. Like Ration was really just chaotic start to finish, and that's what I sort of saw coming out of like that last note of Drowning. Also because Drowning was quite like slow and deliberate, and I wanted Ration to be kind of like fast and just genty almost. Like I really wanted to write just like a simple gent song, which was this like ended up really being. But Ration being about like both physical and mental rationing almost in chaotic scenarios. I wanted this song to be quite chaotic, so I really achieved that using, I'd say, like 3 different techniques. The first one that you can hear right now is just like very fast lyrics. Like I wanted the song to have like I want it to be kind of like almost like a tongue twister almost, because I've never really written one of those before, because the lyrics that I tend to write are very like, the only good word I can come up with is like elongated. So like I tend to let like single syllables and single words go on for a long time, and I wanted to sort of like do the opposite with this song. So I did a lot of like growls that were very quick. And then, so the second thing that I did was for like this chorus that just happened, I used two chords that normally like don't go together well, that like had like kind of like a jazzy interaction with them, which is basically like a C flat major chord going into an A flat major chord. And I did like a cool, like clean sort of like vibrato vocal over top of that I found really cool. And the third thing that I did was play around with the idea of 5/4. So the thing that's happening right now is like the right hand of the drummer is essentially keeping the whole feel of 4/4 alive, while everything else is playing in 5. And it sort of ironically ended up being the 5th song on the album, which sort of like, I guess, works, but really that wasn't intentional. This section, by the way, I accidentally wrote to be much like a Mastodon song. I forget this is off of Emperor of Sand. I forget which song this is. It could be Precious Stones. But there's a part that had like those exact notes in it, and I was like, ah, fuck. I guess I'm keeping it. That was a mild ripoff that I made subconsciously. But yeah, so here's like the chorus bit again, and I actually really like this like central vocal line that I did again, like with the vibrato and stuff, and the whole like the time, like that sort of like gradual build into that like note. I was quite happy with how that turned out. And then again, after this like chorus, it went straight back to the 5 section. The chorus I originally thought would have more of a central role in the song, but it ended up being like a thing that only really happens twice and very briefly. But now we're back into the 5 section. That's like the, like I'd say the outro chorus of the song, really. This part was kind of like was pretty random. I was just playing like rhythms that I thought sounded cool, and after that I sort of like built a drum beat like on top of that. But then this part right here was me just beating the shit out of my guitar. Like I really wanted to embrace like the flappiness of the strings that you get when you tune down, and like get that sort of like semitone, quarter tone bend that you get when you just like hit the bottom string really hard. And I was like, yeah, I could just like make a chorus out of this, like, because the guitars are playing a simple part, but they're in 5, whereas everything else is in 4, so the interaction's still kind of cool. And then the vocals over top of it, I want to sound kind of like sinister and very ominous. And then this section right here, it's one of the 2 sections vocally that I was the most proud of, because they were very, they conveyed what I wanted to convey, like emotionally. Like I wanted this section to feel very like, what's the word I'm looking for? I wanted it to feel very, very stressed, and like as if like something is inevitable, like almost like a foreboding type of line. And so I went with the one type of vocal that I think I'm okay at doing, which is like the raspy, like the growly clean. Because the rest of like the normal cleans I'm not really a huge fan of doing, mainly because I'm not really happy with how I sound when I do it. But that like growly thing, I was really happy with how it turned out, because that was essentially like 1 or 2 takes for that part. And how that like final note sort of transitioned back into like the reprise of the opening of the song. And so yeah, that's Ration. Again, very like aggressive, chaotic, fast song, but again, very deliberate. Heart of the Earth is probably the most interesting song on the record from my perspective. I wrote this quite late into the album's development, because essentially what happened was I came across some of like older material that I'd worked on like before even Return to Life. I'd recorded some stuff, and I had like an instrumental album that I essentially like quote unquote finished, but more or less abandoned. that I uploaded a couple years ago, and there's a song on that was inspired by the Horizon Zero Dawn video game called Zero Dawn. And listening to that, I'm like, I could take, like, I thought that I could take what that song was and make it into something proper. And so really Heart of the Earth is just borrowed stuff from things I wrote years back, but made into a more mature track. And so really, if you go back and listen to Zero Day and Zero Dawn, and those two tracks, they were very like basic, like metal songs with the very basic like chord progressions, but I quite liked the melody that was underlying it because it was kind of like sinister again. And so I decided that I would take those ideas and turn them into a completely different song. Like I wanted Heart of the Earth to be very slow and kind of like a ballad almost. And essentially that's what it ended up being. Like Heart of the Earth is essentially what Zero Day and Zero Dawn were, with a few added chords for like harmonic variety. Like the opening chord of this chorus right now is a chord that didn't exist in Zero Dawn, but then this section right here, the one that started now, is like note for note identical on the guitar, just a little slower because the rhythm of the song when I started writing it was a little slower, but like the chords are exactly the same, the notes are exactly the same, but the song itself is about completely different things. So the original song was, again, very much like inspired by that game, and I liked it a lot when I was playing it. So I wrote a song essentially about like the lore of Zero Dawn, whereas this song, at its core, was essentially a love song, really, and it's probably the only love song that I've really written. And I can't really give you a reason for why, but I just don't really typically feel like writing them. But this one I really wanted to have like a very nostalgic sort of like feeling of almost like when you listen to the song, I wanted it to feel like it's part of something bigger. Like I wanted to feel like sort of like you are being like enveloped by the song. And I like the thematic like principle of having love be the central like lyrical theme for the song, and really, since I have a little bit of time to talk about it, I can talk about like the story for The Depths, because The Depths still has a story underneath it, and I actually feel like it's a little bit easier to follow than the story of Pursuit was, because Pursuit was quite metaphorical in its storytelling, because most of the songs were very personal, just talking about like personal stuff that I sort of twisted with metaphors to be like a story about a guy climbing a mountain. But this one was actually inspired by like real world events. So I was sitting at work. I think this was June. I forget the exact dates when this had, but I think this was like end of June when this started. Maybe end of May, something. End of one of the months. But this album, story-wise, was actually inspired by the Thai cave rescue. So like so I was at work and I didn't really have much to do. So I was following this news story quite like with a lot of interest, because I was like really interested in seeing like everything about it. Really, like the whole process was just fascinating to me. Like the circumstances were not, because the circumstances were quite sad. But the whole like principle of like rescuing people from a cave that they essentially trapped themselves in, like accidentally, really, I found that really interesting, because essentially what happened was, to those of you that don't know, a soccer team after practice in Thailand went into a pretty popular tourist cave to essentially like write their names on the walls, essentially as initiation. And they went in quite deep. Like I'm talking like an hour and a half to 2 hours of walking. And when they walked in, this was like monsoon season. The cave behind them was flooded, and they had no way out, because it was like essentially there was no way they could hold their breaths for long enough to get out. Like essentially the whole passage behind them was very narrow and very twisty and flooded. So they had to like run to what essentially was high ground and sit there for 9 days in hopes of being found. And they were eventually found by British divers. And that discovery essentially sparked like a multiple week-long rescue mission where they're trying to get them out. They're trying to pump the water out of the caves, but the thing is the water kept coming in because the rains didn't really stop. And they were trying to get like food, water, and air to those guys because there's no way for air to get into like the little crevice where they were sitting. And so that was kind of like a very interesting thing for me to just like think about. And eventually at the end of the day, they managed to pump out enough water that most of the distance was walkable in like knee to like waist high water. So they ended up getting all the kids and the coach out. And the only casualty of the whole process was a diver that just like ran out of breath, essentially, while doing some work on the supply line, essentially, or whatever it was, which was what drowning ended up being about. And yeah, so that's essentially the inspiration for the story of this album, and this album was kind of like a more, I guess, Hollywood take on it. Like when the whole thing was over, a lot of people that were commenting on the story were like when a movie about this is made, like this and this and that is going to happen. And obviously that's kind of like the kind of story that you'd make a movie about. Is very, very picturesque. It was very reminiscent of like mining rescue movies, and those have been made before. And so I essentially made the story my own in a way by replacing the soccer team with a couple of strangers that were essentially like brought together by misfortune that ended up finding like comfort in each other's presence. And Heart of the Earth was kind of accepting the fact that although we're stuck here in like this bad situation, there's no one that I'd rather be here with than you. And that was sort of the idea for Heart of the Earth. And like the songs leading up to it were sort of like building up the story to that. And The Bends is essentially the story of their escape, of their rescue. And the Bends was essentially about a plan B option that never came to fruition in real life. But essentially the whole idea of the rescue mission at the start was essentially to give those kids like very like quick and like tunnel visioned diving lessons so they could literally dive their way out one by one, essentially. And this is essentially what this song is about. It's about cave diving, which is a topic that I also read a bunch about, but this is like before the whole story came about. But this is about like, I'd say April, May of last year. I was reading a lot of cool stories about cave diving and how dangerous of a thing it is, by how some people do it anyway. And there was a story that I read about some Nordic cave. I forget. It's like, I want to say it's either in Sweden or Norway, but I don't want to make assumptions because I honestly forget the story. But the story essentially went something like a trio of guys went cave diving through a pretty dangerous pass. And essentially the guy in the middle got stuck and panicked and drowned. The guy in front of him didn't realize. The guy in front of him couldn't rescue him, and the guy behind saw the dead body and turned around and went back to the start. So essentially they were kind of like split up because the guy in front, essentially, like he only had enough air to make it back to make it to the end. Like they were more than halfway in. And the guy at the back essentially was essentially like 180'd right back to the start by seeing like the lifeless like body of his friend. And eventually what happened was, so the guy's like the middle guy's body was still down there. And eventually after the lead guy made it back out of that cave, against like authorities. Like they were like essentially after the guy died, like the police essentially said that that cave was off limits and it was too dangerous to go in. And these guys came back, like against the orders of authorities, to go get that dude's body out, because they wanted to give his family closure. And that story was pretty inspirational and sort of like was another like aspect of like kind of what birthed the story of the depths almost. And so the bends was sort of about like the dangers and like the sheer difficulty that comes from cave diving, essentially, especially if the cave was like flooded by floodwaters, because essentially what happened to the cave in Thailand, because like the floodwaters rushed in so fast, they essentially like lifted all the sediment that was like on the walls and the floor of the cave, and so really all of the water just became very murky and impossible to see, and so the whole operation was just incredibly dangerous because you couldn't see where you were going more than half the time. And so the bends was sort of like about that aspect of cave diving, really. And so this whole like intro heavy section I wrote with the intention of it being very like heavy and like very, I don't know, like almost like an omen of danger almost. And oddly enough, the song is actually performed in quite a weird tuning, because like even on Pursuit, there was 3 songs that I wrote in what could be considered a weird tuning, where it was essentially like drop A flat on a 7, but the 7th string was taken down to G flat, for that extra depth, and essentially you made an octave by playing like 0 on the 7th and 3 on the 6th. Well, this song took another step further. I legitimately tuned the 7th string down to F, and so essentially this was a 7-string version of the tuning that Mastodon sometimes plays in, where they tune a 6 to A, G, C, F, A, D, and get an octave by playing a power chord essentially. So it's very drony sort of sound, and this is sort of the sound that I wanted to achieve on 7, but like with F as the root note. And so this song sounds like it's written on an 8, but it's really not. It's a 7 in an 8-string tuning essentially, with the 7th string skipped. But yeah, the bends was, I think, the second full song that I wrote. Like, this came about quite early in the song's writing process, and at the time this is probably the song that I was most proud of, because I was really happy with the way the heavy section interacted with this like middle clean part, because this clean part was sort of about finally escaping an ordeal that was 6 songs in the making essentially. And this is about one of the characters essentially having made it out and seeing essentially the sky for the first time in like weeks, and being more essentially being thankful for the life that they were trying to escape beforehand. It was very much about like acceptance and stuff like that. So that's what this section was about. And like this whole part was very simple, like, again, harmonically wise. It was essentially like 3 chords, but I was really happy with like the feeling that this part gave off, especially like when the rest of the instruments came in. And so I played around a lot with like harmonies and how I could use like background vocals to really make this part seem sort of like almost like a soundtrack to a movie, and almost like a song that plays like when the good guys have won. So yeah, that's what like this section of the bends is about, and I was really proud of how the heaviness of the first section played with like the epicness of this one, really, because that's like the only real way I can describe how this part feels, because it just feels like a conclusion to something. But in reality, what happens in the story is the character that this is coming from the perspective of the female character in the story, and how she turns around essentially to find out that the guy that she's been sharing this experience with didn't make it essentially. And that was sort of the reason why the heavy section came back, and I did a bit of a cool lyrical thing where I was pretty proud, like lyrically, of this part of the song in particular, because I took the original chorus and essentially twisted a few words to make it seem like the exact opposite of what the first chorus was about. Because the first chorus was about like sort of like sharing an ordeal and like working together, and this chorus was more about like wishing that the two of you had survived the ordeal, sort of. The ending of the song at the last like seconds of the song is a part that I was really happy with, because it essentially culminated in a really high, like aggressive sounding vocal note that was sort of like almost like in anguish, sort of leading into essentially how the first chorus ended, but with more stuff, and then just abruptly ending like that. And you'll hear it in a bit. Like, I'm sure that this isn't your first time hearing the album if you're still here watching this video. But I was very, very happy with how like the song turned out, essentially start to finish. Like, I was extremely happy with all of the riffs that I had, all of the cool things that I managed to do rhythmically with it, the interaction between like the heavy part and then the melodic part in the middle, and then how I brought the heavy part back again to this like sort of like doom ending, like and yeah, so like the Bends at the time was probably the song that I would consider like the most proud that I've ever been in a song, period. But I think Heart of the Earth towards the end overtook that for me, because at the end of the day I was really happy with Heart of the Earth. Like, essentially going back and editing this album, Heart of the Earth, I didn't touch, because I was just so happy with like how everything like pieced together into a nice complete package. But again, the Bends, another like a long song that I was very happy with. Voices was sort of like a mirror image of Echo in a sense, because essentially Echo happens after the opening 2 tracks and Voices happens with 2 tracks to go. I wanted the song to be like another like break mentally, because it followed a lot of really intense stuff, and so I wanted Voices to be like a nice like calm song, and it ended up being more of like a nod to Silent Planet, because that band became more of an influence for me between Pursuit and The Depths. And the way the vocals were done on Ration was very like reminiscent of the way Garrett does some of the like quote unquote rap flow vocals. But in reality, Voices was more of like a nod to how songs like Depths 2 and 3 are, because they're very much built off of like a long dramatic build up into like a culminating sort of chorus. And that's sort of what Voices ended up being. Not initially what I wanted it to be, because really all I wanted was to join. I needed to join somehow the keys of F minor, which the Bends ends in, and the key of B major, which is the song which is what I'd already began writing the Depths 1 and 2 in. So I needed a way to, well, not B major, B minor, sorry, but I needed to go from F to B somehow. Essentially, so Voices was about the transition from F to B flat to E flat and then to B. And so this part right here was sort of was essentially like the big culminating sort of chorus that I wanted like this build up to lead into. And this lyric section, like this vocal part that I sang over, it was essentially like my proudest moment lyrically, like vocally on the album, because really it was just reaching for a note that was kind of high-ish, not like to the top end of my register, but again, I wanted it to feel very like again, very like almost like sung in anguish. And so I sang it basically just by screaming at the top of my lungs, attempting to hit a note with some degree, and that's what I managed to accomplish. So like that's not something that I would like to perform many times back to back, because honestly after like 3 takes of that, I essentially like took takes 2 and 3 and just put them on top of each other, and that was how like that section of Voices was done. But after the 3rd take, I was like, I don't really know if I can do any more of these. But luckily I was happy enough with how that section turned out that I kept it, because honestly it hurt a little bit. And this whole section of voices, like most of the piano track for voices, again, was just like one take. I was just messing around with the chords from The Only Way Out, just the B flat to D flat interaction, and then D flat to E flat, and then E flat to B, which was like the heavy part of voices, and then we stay in B, and that's what depths 1 and 2 start in. When I began, essentially, like, because before this, the same thing happened with Pursuit, kind of, and I typically, like, if I write music, I like to have at least parts of it premeditated, especially if I'm doing a record. Like, I like to have like a general layout of how it's gonna be, pre-planned. It's just the way I like working, and so the depths was already planned to be like a 2-parter. But other than that, I didn't really have much of a plan for the song, because I much like Ration, I began writing the song quite early into the album's like development, but I only really finished it at the very end. I wanted the depths, like the title track, to be like the finale to this album, and so I left it for the end, like intentionally, to make sure that like the feeling that I had in my head was the same feeling that was conveyed with the music, because I wanted it to feel like a finale, and so I wrote it like it was really the finale, because it was the last song that I really had to write, and so that's basically what it was. So depths 1 and 2 are sort of like mirror images of each other thematically, because essentially what happens was, like, in the bends, our female protagonist finds out that her partner doesn't make it, and in voices, essentially, it's the idea of like being called back to essentially go get him. So that she herself can find closure, but so can like his family and stuff like that. And so the depths is about sort of like, again, like the solo recovery mission to like go back and do it herself, because people are saying that this is too dangerous. And so it was like, and yeah, so like story wise, it's about that, but metaphorically, it's also about just like overcoming things that you were initially afraid of, essentially, because like this whole story was sort of like built on fear. Like the Only Way Out, the moment the heavy part of The Only Way Out came in, the first like lyric line was running terrified. That's essentially what the story was about. It's about like running from your fears, and then depths 1 and 2 are more about confronting them and redeeming yourself through that confrontation. And yeah, so that's like the feeling that I wanted this to go off. And just now you heard the reprise of the Echo theme. And when I was writing this part, I sort of managed to put it in accidentally, like it just worked. But towards the end of Depths 2 is when I sort of needed it to fit in and like really be there, because I wanted that like theme to be the last thing that you heard. This section was kind of cool for writing, so I did a lot of like cool stuff on the guitar that was quite experimental for me at the time. Like I was doing a lot of like weird sort of like slidey chords, and there's even like this section is like tapping, and again, much like Ration, there's a bit of like 5/4 play going on over here. And this section, as proggy as it sounds, this whole section can be counted in 4/4, and that's how I tracked it, even though it doesn't really sound that way, because there's a lot of like accented notes that are not on the one. But in reality, that like this whole like the last minute or so of the song was like tabbed out and tracked in 4/4, which I thought was a pretty neat like cool thing. This section, like actually, this section I wanted to do another callback to Ones and Zeros, which is the album where I got Zero Day and Zero Dawn from for Heart of the Earth. And this section was a harmonic callback to the pair of One songs, so One Dream and One Reality. And so like essentially like I felt like I was kind of obligated to give that song a bit of a nod, because it was another like pair of songs that I was quite happy with like the original material that I had for them, and so I wanted to take that material and bring it to a more mature piece of work. That's kind of what I did here. This section right here was sort of like a kind of like a contortionist-y sort of like break section. I wanted it to be like to be a key change in a sense, because I wanted the, like, I didn't want this whole song to be trapped in, like, in B land. So this song was essentially just functioning as like a key change, but it also served as sort of like a break from the initial aggressiveness of the song to like a more dramatic sort of build up, which is like the whole purpose of Depths 1. Because this is like going back down into like the depths that you essentially were escaping for the first 7 tracks of this album. And so like this is the part of the song where really like the whole like thing essentially goes down. Like this is like the final boss fight essentially of the album. And what's about to happen rhythmically in the guitars is a callback to the 9 Days rhythm. So the same exact pattern, even though it's like different notes and stuff. And I added some like faster like 16th notes, but the basic 8th note rhythm of this is identical to 9 Days, and I wanted that to sort of be like more like a hidden Easter egg, because it's not very apparent when you listen to it for the first time. That's like, holy shit, that's like the same rhythm that he used before. But this wasn't me running out of ideas. This was intentional. Even though you can call it running out of ideas too, whatever. But yeah, this section was very fun for me to do, because again, it was more like picturing like a movie and sort of like the final confrontation in it. Like essentially where all of the explosions in the Transformers movies would start to happen. So that's kind of what this was, what I was envisioning this part to resemble, sort of. And so like the whole like slow like ascending buildup was all very much intentional. And yeah, that's Depths 1 Submerge. Essentially, like, it was supposed to become more intense as it went on, and then the opposite was supposed to happen with Emerge, because it's supposed to be like the, I guess, like the happy-ish sort of ending to the album, or at least the closure ending to the album, even though the story itself had a little bit of an unfortunate event in the beginning. But yeah, so Depths 1 and 2 I essentially wrote as one continuous song, even though I knew I was going to split them. And sort of the way I split them is kind of reminiscent of the way like Language 1 and 2 are split by The Contortionist, where they essentially like function as one continuous song. And so I wanted to do sort of like a similar thing, where it's really one song but like split into 2 right before like the really nasty breakdown. So with that thought in mind, my whole idea for Depths 2 was to write a disgusting breakdown and then somehow find a way to bring that breakdown back into familiar theme land. And so this is where the transition happens. I actually made a bit of a video editing error here, because the rest of the transitions had a fade cut, but I fucked up here, so my bad. But yeah, this part I really wanted to exaggerate like the heaviness of this breakdown, because I wanted this song to feel sort of like this is the last song on the album, and I wanted it to feel a lot more impactful than a song like Scattered Light felt, because Scattered Light again had a bit of a finale feeling to it. It was like a slow sort of like ballad-esque ending to an album, and going into this one, I wanted this song to feel kind of like the opposite of that. I wanted it to feel like an ending, but I wanted to feel an ending with aggression, sort of like, instead of Scattered Light being sort of like as the like essentially like if you like a storyboard, essentially Scattered Light happens after the whole like downward slope of the story, and like in the flat like resolution section where everything is okay sort of to a degree, whereas this one I wanted to feel like it was still sort of towards the peak of the story build-up. So I wanted to feel like the album still had like some juice left in it, even though we were getting towards the end. And here I finally start to like bring it back to Depths 1 sections, and the same sort of like slidey guitar part with nice harmonics and stuff. I found this part kind of cool to write and record, like the whole and this part is also a slightly altered section from Depths 1, but in, again, combinations of 8 and 7. Because because I wanted that to be sort of like a theme. Like 5/4 was kind of like a theme that came back and forth throughout the album a little bit, and then the whole like essentially 15/8 part. Yeah, that's like another like rhythmic idea that I wanted to sort of keep and call back to occasionally. This part right here is essentially like combining the intro to Depths 1 with a cool riff that I essentially wrote. I wanted this riff to have a little bit of a bigger role in the song, but in the end I realized that it didn't really fit very well alone, so I sort of just threw it in the background of like a build up back to like where Depths 1 essentially began. And that's kind of like a compromise that I made. Like I wasn't quite happy with how that riff never really found a home, but at the end of the day I was happy enough to just get it in there. It felt kind of like a bit of a plug. But yeah, that's like in retrospect that's like a part that I may have wanted to have a bit of more of an impact, because that riff was essentially what the Depths was built out of, like just like the simple like 0-8-3 riff that I had, and the song was sort of kind of like developed out of it, but the original riff itself never really found a home. But I still managed to get it in somehow. I don't know, like I don't really know how I feel about that. I don't really know where I was going with this. But yeah, so this is like we're getting to like the dramatic finale of Depths 2. Bringing it back to the whole like F sharp minor section that we had near the middle of Depths 1, and then this served nicely as a cadence into E major, which is where the echo theme is built around. And this part was essentially sort of like a nod to the way the Contortionist ended Clairvoyant, which is like with a very like happy but at the same time kind of depressing calm section, which culminates in like a big sort of like a reprise of that theme, but in like a big like grandiose like full band sort of manner. But yeah, so this was sort of like it's supposed to be in that sort of, it's supposed to convey that sort of like general feeling. So yeah, like the lyrics from Echo sort of come back to a degree, except they're obviously different because we're at a different part of the story. But that whole idea of like time passing both of us, even though at this time in the story you know that it's not both of us, it's really just one of us. But in reality it was sort of like reminiscent of kind of like the past, and also essentially accepting that you did what you could to like almost like redeem yourself. By having gone back and like, and essentially like quote unquote save the person that you lost, essentially. And then it goes back into like the full band iteration of the Echo theme. And from the very get-go, from like from the moment that I decided that this would be like a theme that recurs, I wanted this theme to be how the album ends. And so this was sort of like the part that I envisioned to be like the epic conclusion of the album, like the final reiteration of this, like and yeah, so that's Depths 2, and that's really the whole album really done. Now I'll just let it play out a little bit. And yeah, so like and so basically what happened was, after this part was done, I realized that the album was a lot more like intense, and I guess more of like a difficult thing to get through than Pursuit was, because Pursuit had a lot of like a large interaction between like a heavy song and a light song and a heavy song and a light song and stuff like that. So it was easy on like the brain to like listen to for a while. Whereas this album was more heavy for more sections, so I wanted it to have like a nice like reward at the end for getting through almost. So I essentially threw in like a short little improvised like melody that I put on top of the same chords that like make up the Echo theme. And then I wanted to have like a nice long note that sort of fades out the entire thing, and so yeah, this is that's the end of the Depths, and the end of another one of those big old progressive wank fests, essentially. Essentially flexing how you can write a full hour and plus of music about weird shit, and have it all like come to a conclusion in the way that it did. But yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that, but that was sort of like the point that I wanted to make with that was essentially like the end of the whole like big progressive journey that this album was sort of supposed to be. And yeah, so yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that, but let's just cut that idea there. The Depths was sort of like an idea that started as a compromise, essentially. Like, this was essentially me taking my inability to complete Oasis as a big, like, grandiose, conceptual, progressive thing with a lot more, like, focus on the conceptual side of it, and essentially writing something that was simpler and more down-to-earth music-wise, because essentially a lot of the songs are still very much standalone songs. There's only, like, 2 tracks, like Echo and Voices, that I'd say don't work on their own, but the rest of the tracks are still very much, they hold up on their own as, like, singular songs. Maybe the Only Way Out doesn't really work as a single either, but in reality that's sort of just the nature of the album. But at the end of the day, it was something that essentially ended up inheriting the ambitions sort of what Oasis was. And so at the end of the day, I was still quite happy with how it turned out as like a successor to Pursuit, because this album was sort of one that was never really meant to be. Because again, this was like the Depths sort of started off as a dump for ideas that I couldn't fit into Oasis, but at the end of the day, it ended up being the thing that like saved the essence of Oasis, because essentially I essentially binned that project because I decided that it wasn't really personally rewarding to keep going with writing really premeditated stuff, even though portions of this album were like predetermined and pre-planned. A lot of this was still very spontaneous songwriting. I also wanted this one to feel more like a driven record, and so a lot more of this album was written just by like jamming on the guitar and stuff, whereas Pursuit did have a lot of its roots in like keyboard land, and otherwise just messing around in DAW with synths land. And yeah, so I guess that's what I wanted to say about this one. Like, the Depths was supposed to sort of like clean up the sort of mess that Pursuit was in terms of musical direction and in terms of like quality of production and stuff. I wanted to take another like step forward in terms of like what I could do essentially on my own, because essentially like this entire thing, like start to finish, was all a one-man job in a studio that cost as much as, I don't know, a really shitty rental car. Because I don't have much. Like, this whole thing was made with 2 guitars, one interface, no amp. Essentially, like I was using just direct line and using plugins to get like all my tones and stuff, and a MIDI keyboard with a bunch of synths, and that's really all it was. And I was quite happy with how it turned out. There's sections that I would, if I had like infinite devotion to doing the same thing over and over again, the sections that I would maybe go back and really try to like polish down to like a shine of perfection. But at the end of the day, when you work for so long, because essentially this album was much longer than Pursuit from start to finish. Pursuit, I only really started writing in like August of 2017, and I was done by like early December. This one really started coming to life around like May or June of 2018. And by the end of December, I was done. And when you're working on something for so long, eventually you're just like, you know what? I guess it's better if I just leave it at that. You know, there's only so much that I can do that feels natural to me, and there's only so much work that I can put into something like this. And eventually, it's like, yeah, like let's leave it at that. Let's leave some room for improvement if I ever do decide to come back and do this. I know that after the Depths is like released on all platforms and stuff, which should be happening soon. Like it's already up on YouTube and it should be going up on Spotify and iTunes and stuff in the next few days. I know that once this is released and all that stuff is good and done, I know that I want to take a bit more time off musically and really decide what I want to do with this stuff, and see if I can actually like get somewhere with my musical career. Because right now I'm at a time of my life right now where there's a lot of indecisiveness, and there's a lot of like there's a lack of I don't know, there's a lack of knowledge about where everything is going at the moment. And so I'm sort of like exploring my options and seeing what I can just do. And so that's sort of like the whole idea of what's going on right now. And that's sort of where I want this to end off. I want this to be sort of like a conclusion to the more certain part of my life, and sort of like as a lead into to the unknown. Because right now I'm sort of like finally swimming into the deep end and seeing like all of the different routes that I can take with what I can do, either musically or non-musically and stuff like that. So long personal life story rant. As opposed to Pursuit, I'm in a much less like dark place in my life emotionally and stuff. There's still things going on that like I would like to be better. But at the end of the day, this album didn't have nearly as many roots in like depression / anxiety land, which is where a lot of Pursuit came from. So the Depths was a lot more musical in that sense, where there's a lot of stuff that was being born straight out of like the creative process, rather than being like kind of reminiscent about like personal things. And that's sort of where the Depths, I guess, was supposed to differ from Pursuit. It was supposed to be less of a personal thing and more of like just a creative thing. And at the end of the day, I think I got that. I think I got some degree of that across, even though obviously compared to like full-on like production teams, like full-on 5-man band recordings plus like separate mixing and mastering and shit like that, I think this turned out to be okay, at least. So I'm gonna leave it at that. This was sort of like an hour and 12 minutes so far of completely unscripted ranting bullshit. So I really don't know where I was going with any of this. I didn't really have like a point that I wanted to make. I just wanted to talk about this album for a while, because I like reflecting and putting my thoughts down as more of like you can call it on paper, but this is really a video format. But anyway, that doesn't really matter that much by now. This has been me, Anton Kalinin, the sole creator and producer of Return to Life: The Depths. And I'll sign out with that. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Hope you, if you made it this far, congratulations, because I don't know how you did it. But this has been my thoughts and ideas about the Depths and sort of its general process and stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you wherever the road may lead me next. Peace out.